I always have to like look up and check the date on each of these. It's not like I'm idly thinking, oh, I just realized that today is Tuesday, July 27th, and you were at the Kubernetes SIG Testing bi-weekly meeting. I am your host, Aaron Krickenberger, or Aaron of SIG Beard, or SpiffXP in all the places. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube later, where you can all watch yourselves adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct by basically being your very best selves to each other. If you have a problem with the conduct of this meeting, please reach out to conduct@kubernetes.io, or you are also free to reach out to me privately on Slack or GitHub. So I thought today, since we're kind of in the burn down for the 122 release of Kubernetes going out the door, and we have a couple weeks before the V123 release of Kubernetes starts to spin up and the release team gets formed and all that. That this might be a good week to just kind of walk through what we think our plans might be for the next couple of months. As you know, the Kubernetes release team has decided to move from 4 releases a year to 3 releases a year. So I'm using V123. I mean, we traditionally try to pin our planning to the next release, which meant that it was basically quarterly. But at this point, we're talking about basically what's going to get us to the end of the year. The forecast schedule right now is that Kubernetes, the team plans to get Kubernetes 123 out the door the first week of December, since the project traditionally falls quiet after that. So I'm viewing this with the context that we shouldn't do anything super crazy disruptive this week. And then we have kind of 2 to 3 weeks if there's any kind of annoying shuffling around of stuff that would cause pain to the ongoing operations of the project. These would be the weeks to push on that stuff. And then the next dates I'm mindful of, which are not yet pinned, would be things like enhancements freeze, if we have any caps we want to talk about, or code freeze, if there's any code changes that need to land in Kubernetes specifically, and also just thinking of that as the date at which we historically have experienced the most capacity pain for CI testing of Kubernetes. That's roughly the timeline that I have in mind. Since I just realized I'm talking a lot, if somebody wants to take notes, you would be my hero. Excuse me. But we'll muddle through somehow. All right, so I tried to link the main board, which is in the Kubernetes org. I will share my screen for that, but I am primarily going to be looking at the meeting notes as I try to stumble through and find the issues that line up with this, because we have a lot of issues on our board. I've tried to go through and add everything in the Kubernetes org that has the SIG testing label applied to it to this board. The columns are basically blocked if for whatever reason we're just kind of like waiting, or there's something that's preventing us from moving forward. In progress if I know that somebody is working on it. Backlog if I think it would be a good idea for us, if we need to pick something up and work on it, this would be the place to pull from. Help wanted are issues that we regularly go through and make sure are still relevant and important and good places for beginning or intermediate contributors to help out. And then 2 triage is everything else that we haven't really looked at yet. There's no ordering to these columns. The goal would be to try and consistently apply priority labels. So you can see some of these have priority important soon. In fact, a lot of them do. Some of them have priority important long-term, which is tough to see at a glance because it's the exact same color as priority important soon. So I was thinking we might start to consider using the full rainbow here and using labels like priority backlog or priority awaiting more evidence, or heaven forbid, priority critical urgent for the stuff that's really like the most important stuff first. The way I tend to navigate this board is by milestone. So I'm first going to go look at everything that's in the 122 milestone. And just walk backwards from there. This is sort of things that we said we would do by the time Kubernetes 122 goes out the door, or things that could be accomplished without interfering with Kubernetes 122 going out the door. So this first issue here, I don't know if Ben, you want to speak to it more specifically. If you are here, I'm assuming that's the other person who signed in.
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know if I have a ton more to add other than I have just heard from someone that the Firefox workaround no longer works. There's just too much now. No browser sandbox is happy having this much data in memory.
Oh, looks like Safari is, but yeah, we're downloading. I don't think it actually downloads a gig's worth of data. It's gzipped or something to that effect. But when it unpacks all of the clustering data so that I can quickly navigate around and look for things that start with the word CI Kubernetes, this is probably too small. Right, like that just sort of, or exclude anything that has the word CI Kubernetes. I should see nothing. Yeah, I did. Cool. Like the fact that this page can respond that quickly because it unpacks all of the clustering data in the browser. So it's kind of difficult to tell if perhaps a gigabyte of data is an unreasonable amount of data to expect a browser to handle. And it could mean that we need to drastically reconsider the design of this to work in a way that doesn't involve so much data being on the front end. It could also be that we've just been getting a whole bunch more data than we used to. This graph here is test grids showing us the amount of time it takes us to create that cluster data in the first place. So refresher for those of you who aren't familiar, we store all of our test results in a BigQuery database using a tool called Cattle. And then we have something that periodically pulls the last 2 weeks of results out of that database and then attempts to cluster it together. So that's the triage job. And that's what we're looking at here. And I know it's really, really tiny. Maybe I'll blow it up a little bit more. You can see that starting back around the 5th of July, going forward, the amount of time it took to do that started going way, way up, which is probably a sign that it was ingesting a lot more data, which is what I then tried to go look at by looking at the logs. There are over, at least as of the time that I checked this, there were over 3,000 test failures in the bad, slow version of triage that were not in the good version of triage. So it could be that somebody just started adding a whole bunch more tests and algorithmically, this is a bad fit for that number of tests. It could be that there are a whole bunch more test failures that are not clustering well. Because typically, if it doesn't cluster well, that means we have that many more clusters and that much more data to show you. Yeah, and then this was me trying to find some way to graph the amount of test results that we were ingesting, and you can see that it sharply spiked up sometime during the dates that I discussed. my long-winded way of saying I'm not sure that there's an easy fix to make triage go better. We could, all right, after having said that out loud, like we could cut it back to looking at 1 week's worth of results instead of 2 weeks worth of results, just to see if that gives us some breathing room. I see a hand.
A couple of comments. One, Safari is actually not happy with it either. In my copy of Safari, it will eventually render a like tooltip at the top warning you that there's excessive memory in this tab and that closing it will improve the performance of your machine. We do actually have separate data source that's not the complete data source that's like in slices. If you view like a cluster, that still works fine because that loads that data. So we could try to like, we could do more server side to decide like which data you'd want in the default page instead of loading all of it. Like we just have like a huge scroll window here with all the clusters. We could show like the, I don't know, top N or something and load them in as you scroll or something. If someone wanted to rework that a bit, I think that'd be a little bit involved, but short of that, I don't think it's a great idea to say, give us less history or, I don't know, stop playing the tool function. Alternatively, I think I'd probably be most interested in, it seems like we probably we've lost some of our like signal to noise ratio here. I think we like there can't actually be a huge increase in clusters that we actually care about. We haven't had an intentional increase in testing that we care about. So something is making a lot more noise. We should see if we can cut down the noise of the source or have the tool filter some of that out.
Yeah. Which is where I was headed and don't have the time to head anymore. So like I pasted the shell or the bash or whatever that I used to get to this point. I basically was trying to diff which failures we're seeing a lot more of versus seeing a lot less of. And so if a contributor here was interested in trying to take this further, this is the point where we start digging into the actual tests and maybe going and talking to the individual SIGs. And it sure seems like SIG storage might be the first SIG to start with. It's also not lost on me that I see a bunch of things that look like this, which I just don't know about this package API's core validation thing. That's interesting. Maybe go ask API machinery about that. But I've always had this suspicion that the integration tests end up giving us way more data than we need that may not cluster well. Because there's so many things going on in the project, I don't really have time to work on this or spelunk into this too much more. But if somebody is interested in it, I'm totally happy to help offer guidance or insight into how the tool works. We had contributor Michael Kilber work on kind of overhauling all of this to be rewritten into Go instead of Python, which maybe helps make it a little more comprehensible. And he also updated the README from to do document this to something that actually explains the clustering algorithm and how it works. So I feel like it's a bit more approachable. All right. Kate's in for CI Robot as contributor. Arno, do you want to speak to this
one? Okay, so this is part of the migration, the current pro instance pro.skate.io. So I added a new bot that will be used by another pro instance skatesinfra.skate.io to basically we want to basically scope the usage on this bot to the repo gates.io. And this is basically part of the umbrella issue about migrate away from Google organization. Right now, the bot is a member of CMTF. I signed the CLA for it, and is also a member of the Kubernetes org and the Kubernetes SIG. So I think the next step will be to deploy your K-Infra Pro maybe this week, if possible, or in the incoming week.
Okay. Yeah, we'll talk more to that for V123. Thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and bump this to the. Actually, I take it back. I'll leave it in the 122 milestone because it sounds like if you think you can get it done this week, that's within 122. And I think it's not that big of a problem to add it to the other orgs. A couple PRs. The next one, I spoke about this a bunch last week. This is about deprecating and migrating away from this GCS bucket and this GCR repository for all of the CI artifacts that are built for Kubernetes. So this is all the binaries and all the container images you might use to stand up a cluster for E2E testing. I have a large suspicion that the project is mainly the only entity that cares about this to any degree. So we went through and I got help from a couple of contributors. I don't know how to pronounce all of their names, but Berenger, Jack Francis, Cecile, Robert, Michon, kind of helped out in identifying some of the repos across the project that were still hard coding Kubernetes release dev. And in a number of them, I started converging on a solution that's about using dl.k8s.io, which is our HTTP or HTTPS-based redirector, which will just magically point people to wherever the binaries are. So where possible, I did this while cleaning up all the Kubernetes CI-related things. We'll also start looking at doing this for all of the release artifacts as well. Because we have a lot more control on the redirector about where we send traffic and how much of it. But at the moment, the redirector is fully flipped for CI artifacts. So they all come from community-owned buckets. I don't have a pretty graph to show you today, but I will post one on this issue later. And I think basically the only remaining thing is to clean up all the docs in the Kubernetes SIG release repo and make sure that everything looks good. So I anticipate having this work all closed out by the end of the week. If you are aware of any specific jobs that may have had disruptions, here's roughly the timeline we used for rolling things out and fixing things. If I've missed anything here, please let me know. Yeah. The next one, I'm just going to kind of bucket both of these issues. They're related to migrating away from the google.com specific projects for the scalability jobs. So these would be the 2,000 and 5,000 node jobs that are run to help inform whether or not the release that's being worked on still meets scalability requirements. Arnaud, did you want to give an update on where we're at with that?
So what I did over the last week was basically create a dedicated repo and add gallery jobs for those one. Over time, I increased the quotas for this project. I think you basically can see them at the end of the issue. Yeah. Not this one. So okay. So. I went to see Scalability last week to give my report. I noticed that they use a custom build or Golang for the test, but running on community infrastructure is not building anymore. So they need to work on this before I move forward. But I think some of the jobs are running fine on K-Infra. So yeah, I think this is basically the.
Okay.
There's an issue. Okay, increased quota. Next one is basically the issue I basically increase for this project. They also suggest we can basically increase the number of nodes for their pre-summit. It's optional, but we can increase from 2,000 nodes to 5,000 nodes. So I added a new canary job for that, and I'm just babysitting those jobs until they fix the issue with the Golang builds.
Okay. Thank you for that summary. I honestly got to thank you a ton for working on this. It was something I didn't have the bandwidth to check in at all. And I really appreciate you reaching out to SIG Scalability and collaborating with them. I had a suspicion that this might be one of the larger costs that have been hidden from the community.
Anyone in case Central can right now check the cost for this project. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to go.
But page 5, you can directly go to page 5 for this. Yep.
Yeah, it's up there. It's about now. It's about half the cost of our artifact hosting.
But I have like a global question about this, but I'm not sure if I want to. I can ask right now, or basically.
You can ask it. I might punt it to Kate's in for discussion later. But let's go for it.
So I've kind of an issue with resource discovery because over the last 6 months, I discovered a lot of buckets or basically Google and GCP resources create, but I can find a trace on that.
Yeah.
Which make things very complicated to basically say to the community, we should move your jobs to Kate Central. So I'm trying to find an easy way to discover that, or are we basically pushing, are we asking to the community to help us identify what's needs to be migrated? Because I found over maybe 6 to 7 buckets and I can access them. I don't know which browser, in which project they are created, which means I don't know if I need to recreate them and migrate the existing one or just create empty bucket that can be reused when we migrate for Kate Central.
I think largely this is a problem. We're going to end up punting to all of the individual SIGs. Just like we don't really write their tests for them, we don't really write their jobs for them either. I think in going what you're going through with SIG scalability, you are uncovering certain patterns of usage. And what we could probably provide is, if you're using a GCS bucket for this, you should do this. It might end up that we're provisioning a bunch of extra GCS buckets over in Kate's Infoland. It might be that we tell them, stop it. It could be that we say, use this already created GCS bucket and store your artifacts at this path. But I think it's going to need to happen on a case-by-case basis. And I think it's unfair to expect one central SIG to go do all of that chasing down. So like, I appreciate that you've been doing all of this to move the scalability stuff, but I think the model that we're going to want going forward is to ask the SIGs to do this work. I think fleshing out what that process looks like is part of the CROW migration plan that I plan on more fully fleshing out as part of V123. We can talk more about that when we get to that. So the two other things real quick that are in progress. One of them is about migrating away from Kubernetes CI images. I just talked about this, but there's a whole separate issue for it. So I think I'm basically going to close this out, if I remember right. Yes, there were a few references to this that I did not catch yet. Once I update those references, I will close this issue out. The other one is about renaming the default branch for the Kate's.io repo, which SIG testing has a lot of code in. We basically did that a while ago. The last remaining bit of cleanup was anything that references the original branch name, which GitHub will usually helpfully redirect, but sometimes if there are links that are not bare GitHub links, they may not be redirected. So here's an example of how you can hit cs.k8s.io as an API and then use JQ to consume the results. And using this, I was able to generate a checklist of which repos still have references to the old things. Some contributors have then helpfully opened up pull requests to all those things. Many of the closed ones were from CSI saying they have a pattern where there's like a central place that then gets cloned or copied to the other repos via subtrees. So we're just chasing down the remainder of this. I'm going to skip past the rest of the stuff in the interest of time, if that's cool with everybody, unless any of these remaining things are really interesting to somebody that you want to talk about. Okay. I think, yeah, you know what? I will try to drive at the same time here. So looking at the meeting notes, I'm breaking this up into my vision for 123, which I would love input on, is kind of broken up into things that I think are specific to the K8s Infra working group that we collaborate with / are kind of a part of, and things that are more like test specific. So once Arno and scalability kind of complete the migration of the scalability jobs over to community-owned infrastructure, the next largest cost is going to come from serving release artifacts for Kubernetes. So we've already migrated over container images to k8s.gcr.io, but we have not migrated over all of the arbitrary binaries that live in the Kubernetes release bucket. So this umbrella issue kind of covers the idea of doing that process. And my goal is to say that by the time we hit code freeze for V123, we're serving release artifacts exclusively out of the community-owned release bucket. That process is going to look something like figuring out how we want to, like where we want those community-owned artifacts to live, whether we want to block on the concept of a binary image promotion process, the same way that we did for container image promotion, how we want to do syncing from the old bucket to the new bucket. Like I'm kind of the opinion that changing the location of where these binaries are stored is effectively the same as deprecating a GA API, which I think the rules for that are you need to keep it around for at least a year, something like that. We could also go by counting by Kubernetes releases, but like I think it should have the same level of visibility and communication as we communicate for the deprecation of APIs, like the fact that a bunch of beta APIs are going away in 122 is being widely communicated. So we should keep around the google.com owned bucket, and we should make sure that new releases show up there, but we should aspire to move as much of the project as possible and everything that dl.k8s.io serves to community-owned infrastructure. Does anybody have any questions about that at a high level? And actually, as I'm talking, I realized this was one of the specific things about, let's just flip the switch on dl.k8s.io, which I've had a bit of a, I've kind of stepped back a bit from that. And I think, yeah, all right, this is the one that lays out the plan. I think we should consider not just flipping a switch on dl.k8s.io. Like we shouldn't just send all the traffic all at once to the new bucket. I think it would be wise to consider like migrating specific paths or specific URIs. So like first we serve the most recent versions of Kubernetes from the release bucket, and then we sort of gradually serve other things. That way we can just kind of roll up the traffic, hopefully. And I guess part of my concern comes from making sure we don't immediately eat all of our budget. Because my gut tells me, based on graphs, I will find some way to share it later, that the volume of traffic we receive for container images as a community is an order of magnitude less than the traffic we receive for arbitrary binaries. And we're working on understanding how much of that traffic comes from the project itself versus other clouds, how we can mirror these artifacts to other clouds to kind of reduce network egress costs. But that's more of a discussion for Kate's infra. Okay. The next one is a much lighter lift, I think. This is migrating away from the Google project called Kate's test images. So pretty much every single job, like by an order of magnitude, most jobs that run in Kubernetes, like run on prow.kates.io, use everybody's favorite image, Kukins E2E. And Kukins lives in a google.com owned repository called Kate's test images. So the goal would be to take every image that is pushed here and push it to a community-owned repository, which Arnaud hopefully set up somewhere down here. Yeah, so Arnaud set up a Kate's test infra staging repository, and much as we have moved other parts of the project over to community-owned staging repositories, do the same thing here. In fact, there's nothing stopping us from just going ahead and pushing things over to the staging repository right now. I just don't want to flip all the jobs while we're waiting for the 122 release to go out the door. That might be slightly disruptive. But I think this would be a great example of one of the changes that we could do in the lull before 123, because it's basically going to be a bunch of search replace. Any questions about that one? Okay. So the next one, I don't really have a great umbrella issue to point you at other than, let's see, maybe crowd migration. Yeah, develop a crowd migration plan. So Arnaud made reference to the fact that he's standing up something called Kate's Infra Prow. So it is intended to be the replacement for prow.kates.io. The idea is eventually prow.kates.io is going to send you to this new prow instance that runs over in community-owned infrastructure. I created this as a migration plan way back when, and step one of that plan was standing up build clusters in the community-owned infrastructure area. We have those build clusters now. We then moved all of the release blocking and merge blocking jobs over to those build clusters. And then we've learned a lot about the effectiveness of auto scaling and the IO constraints that we have on our build clusters, because this is stuff we could never really see with the google.com build clusters, right? Only a select few people could actually like open up cloud metrics and look at the graphs that show this IO. And now anybody can, as long as you PR yourself into the group, which I will happily approve. So the plan going forward will be to stand up a new instance of Prow, which Arnaud is very nearly done with. And then we're going to turn that on just for the kates.io repo and make sure that we've got that running all of the pre-submits, post-submits, and periodics that make sort of the Kate's Infra working groups stuff go. And then if we're happy with that, we get to talk about the larger plan to migrate all of the other jobs and such over. We also get to talk about what it's going to be like to transition sort of control of handling webhooks from one Prow instance to another. I see Arnaud has his hand up, so I will hand it over to him.
I just want to add some clarification. What we're doing is running two Pro control plane against the same pre-cluster. wish was never done before in the community. I think so. I have now a question about this. Is like a big question. 2 or 3 weeks ago, someone suggested we could cut the traffic to Pro Quesatayo, and during a maintenance window of 4 to 6 hours, we can redeploy Pro in the community on infrastructure, and we done with that. And I think Alvaro said they did something like that in Red Hat, but he was supposed to find some document that is so. This is like, I'm trying. The question is it possible to cut the traffic for a specific amount of hour and shift everything?
I think that's a great question. I need other people's help to scope out what that looks like. So essentially, as much as I like moving fast and breaking things, I am risk averse when it comes to leaving us in a spot where potentially the whole project is stuck for longer than expected. So I would feel a lot more comfortable if we definitely knew what rollback looked like and what sort of mitigation procedures would look like if, for whatever reason, standing up the new instance or not quite having a clean enough cut between old and new caused a bunch of, let's just call it bad data to get generated. But I think it is very true that the engineering and coordination overhead of attempting to do some zero downtime migration from one instance to another is probably more trouble than it's worth if we as a community are willing to accept that everything shuts down for, 4 to 6 hours, potentially 24 hours if things go really, really badly, something like that. I want somebody's help in crafting that. So if you know anybody who is interested, reach out. It's kind of a shame Alvaro's not here because I think some of the OpenShift CI folks may have gone through something similar. So if any of you happen to work for OpenShift, maybe go poke them and remind them that we asked about a plan. Just like whatever their experience was in doing that migration.
It was a rough migration, I'll say that. Sitting from the outside and watching it happen, it was rough. They were going from one OpenShift cluster to a managed one, a separate one that my group hosted. I think there was about 2 days of downtime. They brought it up and then back down a couple times. Now we have this, we have our own CR that kind of describes proud jobs because operators. And in that CR, we actually point at specific build clusters, and that's how we cut things over back and forth.
Yeah, cutting the build cluster stuff over, like I feel confident enough having done that with the release blocking and merge blocking jobs, aside from the complication that Arnaud is talking about where the community build clusters don't and should not have rights to be able, privileges to be able to write to google.com with assets. It's a pretty straightforward process of changing, like adding a cluster field and then seeing if it breaks. I think we did a lot of hand-holding for this, for the release blocking and merge blocking jobs for Kubernetes, since that's a lot of traffic. But I think it's fair to delegate that effort to SIGs. And that is the majority of the cost for what it's worth, is like where the jobs actually run and stand up their clusters to run end-to-end tests is by far the more financial cost than where we run the control plane. However, like I'm so much more excited about running the control plane because I want all of you to be capable of helping run it. Like, frankly, it's kind of what I've wanted to do since I started working on Kubernetes before I worked for Google. So to Arno, the other thing that Arno's question is reminding me of is, so the test infra on-call team that currently manages K8s has like a bunch of scripts and stuff that they use that I believe rely on the fact that it's a google.com project. This is not the only instance of Crow that they manage. There are many. And so it is not clear to me that it could be just a straight copy paste and then all of their stuff would continue to work. And ultimately, my goal is that like this cluster kind of goes out of their hands, that like test infra on call is not a Google exclusive club, that anybody can be test infra on call. And so there is some amount of like tribal knowledge or playbooks or stuff that also need to be documented. I've had a PR out for a while to try and flesh that out a bit. I will link it in the meeting notes if anybody wants to put eyes on it. Because it's written, it's definitely like, I'm just trying to dump a bunch of links and I'm dumping knowledge in sort of the structured format that makes sense to me as I reason about the different clusters and control planes and stuff. But it's going to be useful to have somebody who doesn't know as much as I do give feedback on narratively if it's understandable or not. But like, I think it's totally fair and reasonable to have Crow up and running and managing a few repos. I think the longer stretch goal will be have Crow in K8s infra managing everything. And potentially somewhere in the middle is like Crow in K8s infra is responsible for managing like one org, or it's responsible for managing everything that's involved in the Kubernetes release process. And then we could say like all the Kubernetes SIG projects and stuff, they are responsible for kind of cutting over to the new one. Any other questions on that? Sorry, I know we were looking at a boring screen all the time. I kind of forgot about that. Okay. I'm not even going to show images here because I am realizing how much time we have left. So I will just drag the meeting notes up there. Nope. I'm going to stop sharing. That's what's going to happen. So looking at the meeting notes, all the images used in CI for Kubernetes. CloudView, his full name, C. Panato, a number of other people have really helped get us so very close to the line, making sure that every image that is used for end-to-end tests of Kubernetes, whether it be in the end-to-end tests themselves or in manifests that are stored in there or whatever, all come from community repos. They're just a few last things that didn't quite make the test freeze deadline. So I think it is totally fair and reasonable to finish that in the next couple of weeks once 122 goes out the door. Then the annoying, like, detailed stuff is there are a bunch of specific projects like authenticated image pulling and no D2E test images and stuff like that, that we need opinions from the SIGs who actually wrote these tests or care about these tests. Some of these are related to authenticated image pulling. And like, that's a really interesting question to answer in the context of like a cross-cloud registry mirror. Like, how do you have a cross-cloud authenticated registry, right? So just kind of, we just got to figure out like, what was the purpose of these tests with these authenticated projects, and do they still make sense? And if so, how do we re-implement the same set of credentials or hard-coded whatevers over in community infrastructure? let's see. I bucketed a whole bunch of stuff under this, but since I just gave an overview of Kettle and BigQuery and Triage and all that stuff, like those are all different individual components, but most of them run in the same GCP project called Kate's Kubernetes. And I would like to see us have migrated at the very least the historical data set, like that BigQuery data set should live in the community-owned infrastructure. The stretch goal would be everything. So end to end, there's an instance of Kettle running in Kate's infra that's writing to a database in Kate's infra that's being queried by jobs that write metrics to Kate's infra. And the super stretch goal would be that is visible via Data Studio dashboards that anybody can create, so that CI Signal could be empowered to like write the reports with graphs that they need instead of scripting a whole bunch of things out of JSON. And then the final thing is, because we have like 100 and something different jobs that all try to build and push images to our community-owned infrastructure, but they all do it with the same service account and the same Google project. We hit quota issues all the time. And I think the correct way to solve this is for them to use a service account that is in the project that they are trying to push their images to. It's a lot of boilerplate, but it shards things out a lot more cleanly and concisely. If we do that, I think most everybody's flaky problems pushing images goes away. That's all the Kate's infra stuff. On the testing side, I want to hand over to Amit to talk a little bit about kubetest 2. What are we planning on pushing forward with for kubetest 2 in the next cycle?
Yeah, I can give a quick update. So we've been making some good progress on that, Cap. I don't have it handy here, but the thing that we were targeting, at least for this release, was to get testability, like being able to test scale tests and node tests with kubetest 2. And we already have the cluster loader tester working, and we are still working with SIG node to figure out the details on how the node tester will finally and who will own it, and details around that. But we already have a PR out for that, which once merged means that we are unblocked to start migrating node tests. I guess once code freeze and like all the craziness ends, we can start creating shadow jobs for the pre-submits, really pre-submit blocking jobs, which would be one node test and one scale test. And we already have a shadow job for pull Kubernetes E2 EGC. So yeah, I guess we will be unblocked to start migrating some of the pre-submits. We've already had good success with one of the release blocking jobs that we migrated in the last release, which is the GC conformance job. And that's been the default for 122. And we haven't seen any delta between the old kubetest job and the new kubetest 2 job. So yeah.
Awesome. I think I know this is kind of random, not to put you on the spot. I think I saw somebody poking an issue about making kubetest 2 released binary or released image instead of always pulling down the latest build. How far are we from doing that sort of thing?
Yeah, so good point. We actually have made progress in the way that kubetest 2 binaries are now built into the kubekins image. And we no longer need to pull we no longer need to go get kubetest from directly from the repo. And so kubetest 2 is actually the entry point for the jobs that we have already migrated, which means the goal of being able to reproduce it locally is much cleaner now, and you don't need to go get at runtime.
Are we ever gonna will it be possible someday for somebody to go install kube test at like a specific tag or something?
Yeah, so I mean, we can already go install and go get kube test 2 at a specific commit. I'll probably plan a tagged release around the alpha milestone of the KEP. So all the things that we currently have pending, like the kube test 2 version issue that we have, once those are closed out, I'll probably tag a V1 release, and then folks can directly start go getting at the V1 release.
Thanks. I'm gonna, in the interest of time, skip over a couple things and talk about the two that I think are most important. One, we need to document merge blocking job criteria. People have been like, what I'm seeing is a trend of people increasingly asking to have their pet configuration of Kubernetes be merge blocking to the repo. And as we start to think about things like CSI drivers being extracted out of tree and cloud providers being extracted out of tree and the various container networking interface plugins and the various container runtimes available, we need to have a conversation about avoiding the complete Cartesian product, multi-dimensional matrix of pre-submits all running against a PR. For context, today, there are 12 jobs that run against every single pull request. They can take up to 75 minutes to complete. Actually, sometimes the scalability job takes 2 hours. And just based on their flake data over the last week, you have a 66% chance of passing all the tests. Hooray! I mean, it's better than a coin flip, right? That's cool. But we probably need to like make that better. And so part of that's going to involve putting some criteria in place around the flake rates of jobs, and also policies for like why these jobs, why these configurations, why are these tests in this job? Because, you know, it's a code base. The number of tests that people add to it just kind of monotonically increase over time, which means unless we change how we're running the tests, the amount of time we're going to wait is going to grow over time too. So we need a forcing function to kind of keep things smaller, lower, faster. There's this like long-term vision of with cloud providers being extracted out of Kubernetes sometime over the next couple of releases, we should start thinking about what it would mean to land your code in Kubernetes without actually using a cloud provider. You know, without actually having to spin up a complete set of VMs and cloud disks and attach all the things and whatnot. This is why we have Kind doing the level of testing that we do. If we were to drop everything out today, there's going to be a gap in testing for things like stateful workloads that we as a community need to figure out how to cover. I'm going to put together a quick sketch of merge blocking criteria and ship that out for discussion before the next release. The other one is that jobs used to have their images bumped by the test infra on-call folks, kind of on a daily basis. And that no longer happens because the test infra on-call folks are used to their bump PRs that are just about bumping prowls binaries being automatically merged every 6 hours. We could consider doing the same for job image bumps. This is now something that the community has the power to control and decide. So we should figure out what to do about that, because it seems like right now I have noticed that people will land changes relevant to kubekins, but unless they actually go then change the job configs and get a bump PR out and merge it, it could be up to a week before they see those changes take effect in CI tests. Everything that I have laid out here is a lot, and I use we in the royal community sense. I don't use it in the, I happen to work for a particular employer, and I have some teammates who also work for this employer. It's more like, if you think these things are important or cool and want to work on them, joining in and helping out is the best way to make that happen. If you think what we've discussed here is less important than something you think would benefit the community more, let's have a discussion about that for sure. Because, you know, ultimately, whoever shows up and does the work gets to decide what work gets done. This is mostly a information blast. I'd love to try and find a way to have more of a roundtable discussion about this sort of stuff next time. Hopefully this gave you all some level of insight into what I mean when I talk about SIG testing having a ton of work ahead of us. Thank you all so much for your time, and I hope you have a happy Tuesday.
Thanks, Aaron.